I'm Carl Baldassarre, and we're going to take a deep dive into the song Heartbreaker by Led Zeppelin and look at the artistry of Jimmy Page. And just a little bit of background. I'm really going to not teach this solo or the guitar part, but really kind of share my experience in listening to it for 50 years and kind of reflect on its importance in history, and also try to give you some insight maybe that was going on in Jimmy Page as the guitarist when he created the song and the more importantly the solo. So let's get started. The first thing that strikes me when I think back about this solo, I first heard it in 1969 when the album came out, Led Zeppelin 2. And my sister had come home from college and brought some albums that were relevant at the time and put some headphones on me, and I heard this Heartbreaker and I heard the solo. And honestly, the world stopped at that point. I'd never heard anything quite like it. And I think actually in 1969, there really wasn't anything like Heartbreaker and that guitar solo, because that guitar solo was pretty unique in the sense that the band had stopped, and then this runaway freight train of this improvised, very passionate guitar solo came out from Jimmy Page. And that's been done a lot in the history of music. Those are called cadenzas, and in classical music you'd see that all the time. In piano concertos, violin concertos, you'd see the soloist would have a moment where they could just improvise and the entire orchestra would stand down. But in this case, I don't recall any guitar player ever having that kind of a cadenza solo in a rock song prior to 1969. There were probably drummers that would have their moments, but I don't ever remember rock guitar. I think that was the first one. And it actually, you'll see it wind up being imitated by Eddie Van Halen 10 years later in the late 70s, I think it was, when he did Eruption. It was the same thing. Jimmy Page was the first Eruption on the Heartbreaker solo. And it's quite an amazing journey. So my experience in listening to it and trying to play it and learn it, and I've been continuing trying to understand it and learn it my whole life, I realized early on that you'll never play it note for note, and I don't think that's the object of that particular solo. I think the whole point of that solo is to try to capture the passion and capture the emotion and the gestures of it. I think that's the best way to try to recreate that solo. In fact, you can't play it note for note. Jimmy Page never played it note for note. That's because there's a lot of other things in there other than notes. And if you zoom in and slow it down and really analyze it, you'll hear all sorts of artifacts in there that are really part of the color and the expression of the passion of that runaway freight train. As I think about it, historically, it was epic, and it was the first of its kind. And it also kind of points to the uniqueness of Jimmy Page as a guitar player, in that it was really a piece of art as opposed to like guitar itself, because it was a collection of shapes and gestures and forms and texture, as opposed to like just being guitar notes. And so let me kind of go into that a little bit and share with you kind of my thoughts about it as I've tried to learn it over all these years. It starts off with a great introduction, which is the and that's kind of a nice sort of attention. Here we are, and there's a little bit of humor I find when he does the. To me, that's a laughing gesture. And it's a great way to kind of, kick it off. Don't take things too seriously. And but then he starts to follow it up with the actual real solo. So that's just sort of kind of a setup. And then you'll notice where he goes from there. It's so in that little opening phrase, I hear a bunch of different things. I hear the first part of that is a very quiet, damped sort of sound. And I think I've learned over time that if you want people to listen to you, speak quietly. And when you speak quietly, people lean in. And I think the opening of that solo there is really to encourage you to lean in to this, so it's damped. And you'll notice also a big tendency that will come up time and time again with all great musicians, whether they're guitar players or you name it, is the concept of bending. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in this episode. But this is an interesting bend because he does a partial bend, and then he follows it up with a fuller bend. So they're actually different pitches. They're kind of in there. And it's kind of a question, and then it answers it. So there's a question, there's an answer. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of, I'm not telling you where to put your fingers. There's all sorts of ways to do that on the internet, and you can slug through all that. This is the way I'm hearing this. And I think to really try to capture the emotion of that solo is to kind of think about it like that. So I hear which is sort of an echo of the opening lick that he did, where he was doing the laughter part that I was pointing to. He kind of brings that back. So there's always a little bit of humor lurking about. And but then we start the luge ride of the solo. I'm going to break it down for you slowly. It won't have all the artifacts of the pick ripping and raking, but you'll see he starts to wind up. And these happens in groups of 4. Notice where he's starting, because he's going to climb, okay? And he's going to create some tension. So it's up. And then he's going to move up. And then he's going to move up yet again before he starts to cascade back down. So let's have a look at that together, right? So that's the highest note in the phrase. And so this is the E flat's the highest point that he gets to. Then he starts to come down. And he starts to tumble down. So he's in that few seconds right there, he's exploded up and down in terms of notes. He's accelerated and he decelerates through that. And I think looking at it in terms of those shapes is kind of really the best way to describe the solo. And I look at his ending note on that particular phrase where he's at. He's ending with this tritone sort of sound. It used to be called musique diabolique back in the 1700s. It was forbidden to play this interval because it's the most unstable interval. But he does it there, and then that sets up the next run of notes that he does. So as he's tumbling down, and he winds up again. And then he wraps the solo up with this figure here, these 6th. What I love about that is different types of 6 that he's playing, major and minor 6s. But he's ending on this, which is kind of a D chord in the first position. And he's getting ready to go to the next part of the solo, which is an A chord. So he's actually doing a cadence, which is called a plagal cadence, and it's also known as the Amen cadence. Go, Amen. What I love about that is that this whole solo for me was a religious experience. And that cadence at the end where he gets to, and he's getting ready to set up to the, is absolutely stunning to me how he sets that up. Now, I'm not saying that he calculated all of this, that great musicians and artists are very intuitive, but let's not forget that I think because he went to art school and then he spent a lot of time in the studio as a studio musician long before Led Zeppelin was even formed, he had already accumulated a lot of sense of aesthetics and art and music before he even brought Led Zeppelin, forth. So I think that all of his instincts and intuition and the balance between being a musician and being an artist are really the secret behind understanding how to play Jimmy Page. So that's the big epic guitar solo, kind of broken down aesthetically the way that I see it. And we're going to move on to now the second half of the solo. But before we do that, I think actually that this solo was inserted after the fact. That the song, I believe, was probably two rock songs, which had the opening of the song. And then when that was all done, as he was concluding, getting ready to go into the solo with the I think it was supposed to go in there, and they split the song in half in the studio. They were recording in 1969 while they were on tour, so they were in different studios, and it was there was something so immediate about that whole album, Led Zeppelin 2, because it was being done in different rooms at different days, and I have a sense that guitar solo, the cadenza, the one by itself, was inserted after. They literally cut the tape, spread the two parts apart, and he laid down the solo at a separate time. And why I say that is because the guitar during that solo is actually not in tune to the rest of the song. In fact, it's a half a step lower. And that suggests to me that maybe he just tuned the guitar to himself and didn't put it in concert pitch, because it doesn't matter if you're not playing with anybody else. As long as the guitar is in tune to itself, it can work. So I have a sense that maybe it was dropped in after the fact, but lucky for us, it was dropped in. And again, I just want to reiterate that if you're attempting, like I have, to play that solo, I don't think the idea is to try to cover it note for note, because it was only played one time in the history of humankind. It was that day in the studio. We're all fortunate that there was a microphone and a tape rolling, and I think that was it. It was a one and done experience, and Jimmy Page never tried to cover it again, and everybody who tries to cover it, I think the ones that do it successfully do it more from a perspective of trying to recreate the passion of it, as opposed to try to do it note for note. Because when you try to do it note for note, you actually have to insert your own notes in there, because there are some raging raking that he's doing where he's, some might say that it was sloppy. I'll have another episode on was Jimmy Page sloppy or not, because he certainly wasn't in most regards. That actually, if you try to play it perfectly, you're going to have to put some of your own notes in there to kind of fill it out. And it'll sound too surgical, and it'll lose its sensuality and its passion. So again, it's really about sort of, personifying the artist as opposed to trying to perfect that performance. So when we now fast forward and we go to the second solo, the entry to the second solo, which is really a cue for the band to come back in, is this great chord figure, which is... And what I love about that is that the trick to that sound for me is actually he's upstroking those power chords, and they're enormous when you do that. If I were to just do your garden variety, bog standard A chord, that's a nice sound, but it doesn't sound like this. That reverse rake, that is huge when you play that on the guitar, and it never stops giving you a smile when you do it that way. So that's what I'm hearing is... The other thing that's really cool about the intro to that solo, where he's cueing the band to come back in, is that he's using those same 6 intervals that he used to come out of the solo. So he's going... Same figures that he's using. So there's a nice symmetry to that. Again, these are kind of the shapes and forms that he used. I think it's informed by him being an actual artist as well. So once we get rolling back into the to set up the solo on top of that, you're getting this kind of classic Jimmy Page as a textured type of artist, where he's putting overdubs together. So he's got this figure. And then he's adding in the background this figure. All right, and then he adds, to start the solo on top of all of that, he's adding these kind of unique power chords. They're absolutely the anti-power chords, but they sound huge. He's playing these little thirds, little major triads. See how gorgeous that sounds? That's just a little triad, but he's actually voicing it in such a way where it's open and inverted. So that's a C triad, but I've got the E in the bass, so it's a first inversion triad. But on the guitar, it sounds huge. And he moves it up a whole step, moves it down a whole step, and then he adds that figure before he then comes in with the... So it's just a gorgeous frolic while the band is blowing doors behind him, and he's got this sort of 3-octave intro that he does with the... So from this A to that A to that A. And here's another important insight into great musicians and Jimmy Page. It gets back to the bending thing. So you'll notice he's doing the... Great musicians bend with the end in mind. And what I mean by that is that when he's bending that figure right there, he's on a D, and he wants to get to here. And all great, I think, artists and players, they play with the target in mind. They can hear the note before they play the note. That's always a better way to go because then you're just sort of trying to feel for the note. So for me, if I was given a piece of advice when I was younger, it would have been to actually try to hear my target note before I play it and really develop a really quick sort of anticipatory ear. I wish somebody would have told me that when I was 17. But nonetheless, that's where I'm at. But notice how his bending is pitch perfect. So when he's doing the... you'll notice he's taking the D, going to E, and watch this. If I check the bend to the real note, it's the same note. And it's happening because I'm thinking about the target note, and I'm bending to it. Now that's a minor third bend there on that A, up to the C. See? That's the note, there's the bend. So, I mean, all through Jimmy Page's playing, these bends to me are like brush strokes, you know, and he's just kind of smearing paint on canvas. And I find a tendency in his playing to actually, it's kind of taffy pulling. You'll notice his studio playing, he's extremely precise in the studio, and in live playing, the whole band actually is stretching, and his bends get bigger on live on stage. He's taking more chances. They're cliff diving and jumping off things without nets, and the bends are wide and far. So I see this exaggeration, but really all of his bends are so beautiful and expressive and pitch perfect, and there's a lot of emotions that are happening on the way up, you know, at the end of it, you know, and the way he comes out of it. So they're filled with meaning, the bends. They're just not things that you just chuck off and you do them. They really add the color. I mean, I think the story of a lot of the soloing is in what's happening, you know, during those kind of bends. The other thing that I see him doing a lot is changing from minor to major, you know. So as he did the... So we're kind of in a minor-y kind of pentatonic feel, but then he does... He's actually outlining an A major versus the A minor in the pentatonic. So, yeah. So those change of colors, the major to minor, is something you'll hear him do a lot. And he's taking the third of a chord and he's either making it a major third or a minor third. And the thirds of the chords are what give the quality to the chord. And he's always sort of shape-shifting between the major and the minor. The other thing I'll say on this solo, that second half solo, is he's doing some callbacks. And a callback is a technique that I was made aware of in actually literature, and either it's in lyric writing or in any kind of literary sort of pursuit, where you'll make a statement at the front of a story during an exposition. You'll say something, and you're reading it for the first time or hearing it for the first time, and you just think it's sort of a thrown off line. It's whatever. It's not that terribly remarkable, but you pay attention to it, and then you go through quite a series of events, and then later into the story, that line gets referred back to, and that's called a callback. And even though you're playing the line just later in the story, it has more impact because of the distance traveled between when you first heard it and then when you hear it a second time. And he's doing that again in this guitar solo, I think, where he's at the opening of the solo when he's doing these. He's actually doing that again when he gets to the second half of the solo. Right here. That is the same figure, essentially. So he was doing the first time in the cadenza when he was just by himself and he was doing that absolute impassioned explosion on the guitar. And then when the band comes in, he calls back that same figure. I think it just gives it more meaning when you do stuff like that, when you refer back to previous utterances on the guitar, and he does it there as well. He then proceeds to wrap that solo up with that figure that, and that's the biggest bend of all, where he's actually, I think, almost pushing to a major third bend that, not quite the E, but he's. And so yet another very expressive, emotive swash of paint that's going on the canvas. And then he comes out and he rejoins the band. And this is sort of the cue to the band that we're winding up here, and it's this figure. And he does it a couple different ways on the overdubs. You'll hear it where they're kind of mixing in and out different things. He'll do it with chords. And that's a cue for the penultimate figure, which is this figure. And then the final figure. And that's a callback as well, because he's doing this little... And he's hitting that tritone, which is the same kind of tritone he was hitting... But he was doing it lower in the beginning, when he was going down to the. Same kind of concept, that tritone, very stunning sort of figure right there. And that's how he wraps it all up, cues the band back in. And then they come back in with the chords in the last verse of it. So we talked about the Heartbreaker Jimmy Page guitar solos, the first solo and the second solo, and kind of the history behind it, and some insights that I have that just turned me on about it. And but it would be really sort of negligent of me not to talk about actually the song and the riff itself. I think it's great, and probably the most remarkable thing about the song, or I'd say the most important thing to actually get it right, is actually just the distance between the first note and the second note. And it's nothing that you can notate. You can't literally write this out and notate this. You just have to kind of hear it. And again, it has to do with the Jimmy Page, bending kind of thing. So the riff, right? Right? I think what makes that happen, apart from it just being a great pitch collection of notes, is this bend to get it started. And what makes that so great, it's not this. It's not just a quick, it's a really expressive, long, slurpy bend from this G into the A. Every time he does that, he's rotating with that scoop in, and I think that's where the emotion is on the riff. The rest of it's just sort of target practice, getting your fingers on the right spot at the right time, playing around this blues scale. So I would say if you're going to focus on anything, on trying to get the Jimmy Page color is get the bend, right? And then the rest of the song, honestly, is just he's taking that figure and he's moving it up. But it's not just as simple as that. In my opinion, I think, again, it's sort of the tension and release that he creates in the song by doing it that way. So it starts in A, and then it moves to B, and he bends back. And so we've got A and B, so he's climbing up. And anytime you raise up in pitch, you're raising up in energy, and the excitement and the tension is building. And then when you get into the the end of the first half of the song, he's raising it up even further. With a bend. And he does it up even further. We're not done yet. So he's climbed it all the way from A to B to a C to D and E. So he takes the figure and he's moved it through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 keys, if you will. And that is and by the time he climbs it up to E here, you're about ready to, let go. It's tremendously exciting. And then he takes it out to this. Right? And that takes you to the solo. And the only thing I want to talk to you about is just the architecture of tension and release. He builds you through that A all the way up to the E, and your tension, and he lets it go then with the... And he drags it off almost like he's tired, exhaling right there. And then that completes that moment, and then we're back into we're into that solo, right? So I think that's just something that I appreciate as a composer, just how he took that riff, that simple, blues scale riff, added that expression, and then moved it up through all those 5 phases and created tension. And he repeated the same lick, but he just moved it through those different kind of modulations, and it created increasing excitement. He didn't change a note, he just transposed it up. So that's really great. And then when they return after the end of the solo, they go back into the actual verse part. And then ultimately it ends with the line. So he bookends the song back with... And we might as well take it to the bitter end. I always like to listen to the final utterance of any musician's statement, and the song ends. There's a funny sort of cutoff on the end they do, where they're going... Heartbreaker, heartbreaker, heart, right? So the last one is this. He's got that upstroke, that sort of indiscriminate G-sounding thing, which is just a bolt of lightning, and you're done. And then you move on to the next song, which is Live and Love and Made. So there you have it. There's 50 years of listening to Heartbreaker and thinking about it, both, whether as a matter of history, as a matter of guitar playing, as a piece of art, as a piece of passion. To me, it kind of just represents all the spectrums of life. And it's an epic thing. I hope you enjoyed this insight. Thank you.